James Matthew Wilson, I'm very excited. He is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and the founding director of the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. An incredibly successful creative writing program. And he has written, not only is he a renowned cultural critic and poet, but you may have seen his work in places like First Things, The New Criterion, The Wall Street Journal, The American Conservative, National Review. We are very pleased to have him here today to speak about the Catholic imagination in modern American poetry. So please help me welcome him to the stage.
So it's really a great honor to be here. In fact, I have so many prefatory notes that the lecture might be have been going on for an hour before I get to my subject for tonight. Just because, first of all, it's a great honor to be able to join you all and join Lumen Christi. As an undergraduate at University of Michigan, and then as a Master of Fine Arts and doctoral student at Notre Dame, I didn't know that much about the University of Chicago, even though my brother had done his MBA at the University of Chicago. But little by little, I kept meeting all these converts to the church who had been formed by Lumen Christi, including one of my closest friends, Mark Schiffman, whom you've probably met from time to time. And so it's wonderful to be here. It's also always a joy to return to Chicagoland. My mom's side of the family ran a tavern down at Blue Island for over a century. It was uninterrupted during Prohibition, so I come from very good, dogged and tenacious roots. So, and that's when I first started at Notre Dame. The very first weekend I was at Notre Dame, I immediately left and came to Chicago and took my friends to the tavern to shoot pool. It was wonderful to be there. So it's always great to be back here. I won't mention the Cubs, but I could. Anyhow, so what I want to share with you tonight is, in one sense, a kind of weird promissory note. And here's what I mean by that. This I think, rather elegant slide that you're seeing before you is the cover of a very small book that I published in 2014, The Catholic Imagination in Modern American Poetry. And it was a strange moment. My publisher at Wise Blood Books had asked me to do the second book in a series of very small books. The first one was published by the poet Dana Gioia called The Catholic Writer Today, and mine was to be the second. And they asked what I wanted to do it on. I said, well, I really want to do this. But the problem is I had a 500-page book planned that also had the same title. But this was such a good title. So I gave the title away to the book, and it was just a tiny little 34-page perfect bound thing that was just a super short, condensed history of the Catholic presence in American poetry from the turn of the 20th century to the present. But I thought of it as a promissory note because while I published this, I vowed that someday I would get that 500-page book done, and it's not done. But it will be done sometime in the next 2 years, and in fact, the project just keeps sort of evolving. Eventually, it will be an anthology of Catholic poetry in the United States that will accompany my book, so it'll be suitable for private study and for schools and so on and so forth. So what I want to share with you tonight is the sort of tightrope walk between 35 pages and 500 pages, and it's just a sort of evening reflection on what has happened over the last really 150 years with the presence of Catholicism in America writ large, but also Catholicism in American poetry specifically. And it's I think, quite an interesting story. So I hope you'll join me for it. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes, great. So years ago, I lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, the home of Emily Dickinson. And you can still go visit her house today. It's a historic site. It's well worth visiting. Amherst is the traditional New England town plan with a common in the center of it that once was truly the common where you could graze your cows in common with everybody else. And then surrounding the common is the downtown. And high on the hill, at the highest point of the town, is St. Bridget's Church. You go down the hill about 2 blocks, or roughly the equivalent, and you arrive at the Dickinson house. So those of you who know anything about Emily Dickinson, if you know anything, it's going to be that she spent all her time as a recluse in her room writing poems that she then sewed together in what are called fascicles, little packets of poems that were hand sewn together, and then she just stored them in a trunk. She didn't generally share her work, and none of her work was published until after her death, well after her death. She came from good New England Presbyterian stock, and in Amherst, in fact, was an especially conservative Protestant small town on sort of the western Massachusetts frontier. Who would have then been going to St. Bridget's Church? Among them, among the parishioners, were the servants in the Dickinson household. They had all Irish servants, and they would go up the street to St. Bridget's and back down. I was a parishioner at St. Bridget's in my years there, 2 years there. But so this evidently could not have been without effect, because over the course of the 1,000 or so poems that Dickinson wrote, as the years proceed, as you get sort of towards what we believe to be the latter poems, little by little you begin to see these exotic ornaments cropping up in her poetry that are Catholic ornaments, almost like a monstrance suddenly just shining out. You say, where did that come from? That's how it is in her poetry. In fact, a fellow I'll be mentioning later tonight, the poet and critic Ivor Winters, he observed in one of his essays on Dickinson that as she matured in her poetry, she began to become a more distinctly Catholic poet. That's how he put it, which he thoroughly approved for reasons I'll mention later. But, well, just briefly, that Winters, no Catholic himself, had fallen in love at an early date with Thomas Aquinas, and so for him to call Dickinson Catholic was a compliment indeed for him. So, okay, so in her work, we find these strange little moments, and here's an especially robust such moment because the whole poem is shaped by it. I've heard an organ talk sometimes in a cathedral aisle and understood no words it said, yet held my breath a while, and risen up and gone away, a more Bernardine girl, yet know not what was done to me in that old chapel aisle. Being in Chicago, it's really hard not to mispronounce that word, Bernardine, I want to say. Near Chicago, anyhow. But what a kind of curious poem that, unlike many of her poems, actually feels almost like a pretty literal transcription of what might have happened in her life, which is that she could have probably wandered into the church of St. Bridget's. She could have heard the organ play. She could have felt herself becoming more Bernardine, that is to say, more developed in the shape of her soul, the shape of her life, be more developed in the direction of the great Christian theologian and mystic, St. Bernard. What we can say for sure about this poem, regardless of whether she actually ever went into the church where her servants prayed, is that the poem is using the language of cathedral, organ, and aisle as something exotic, something foreign. If you know any of Dickinson's other poems, they're chiefly constructed by her using her kind of wild imagination, kind of like a lasso, and just trying to cast it out as far as she can, and to see what she can bring back. And so she tries to find the strangest image. sometimes they're not that strange, but they're always a little bit wild. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, and then the carriage held but just ourselves and eternity. So most of her poems are constructed by thinking about something very common, like death or immortal life, and then trying to come up with the most unpredictable image to help you envision this sort of fundamental existential experience. So what's curious about this poem is that the weird stuff is the bric-a-brac of Catholicism. And so if there's one thing that we can say for sure about the poem, it's that one of the reasons that this stuff is here in the poem is because it seems kind of weird to her. So it's not that she is Saint Bernard, it's that she thinks it would be kind of strange to be Saint Bernard, and so she's she's praying, or she's writing about that. Another sort of beginning moment where we can sort of orient ourselves is, and let me just make sure you can see this well, is with this fellow, Henry Adams, descendant, grandson, or is it grandson or great? Yeah, grandson of John Quincy Adams, fourth president. So, Adams was formed in good, not Amherst conservative Presbyterian, but rather Boston Brahmin, increasingly secularizing Unitarian stock. And in fact, one of the reasons that Adams is such an important figure is that he represents the end of the New England Protestant tradition. Some of you may know his autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams, which he took the unusual move of writing in the third person. So Adams did this, as he's talking about himself. But one of the reasons that that's considered such an important text is because it describes the gradual declension or disintegration of both a vision of the world and a moral ethic. In Adams' case, it was sort of the strong Protestant vision of being a city on the hill and of serving the kingdom of God, gradually declining into the mere materialism of modern American industrial democracy, of which he despaired so much that he did what many Americans did at the turn of the 20th century when they didn't like factories that much, and they moved to Europe. And there he wrote a book, Mont Saint-Michel et Chartres, about the great monastery church and the greatest of the Gothic cathedrals, the Chartres. And the book he wrote is entirely admiring. His attentions are kind of threefold: to the great medieval cathedral itself as a vision of the world, the great cathedral in thought of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and the great cathedral in verse, Dante's Divine Comedy. And in all of these things, and in every aspect of medieval Christendom, Adams finds the antithesis of modern American democratic culture. He finds a place of order, of unity, cohesion, and of purpose. Now, I'm a poet. I didn't even know physics when I took it in high school, but which is the law of thermodynamics that says everything tends towards entropy? Second, thank you. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't know what the first one is, so we've got at least we've got the second. So Adams, having been convinced by the atomic or material disintegration of the world, believed that the second law of thermodynamics was what governed history. So you start off with a clutch of energy, and it gradually dissipates. And that's what he saw the modern world as leading towards. In consequence, when he looked at medieval Europe, what he saw was something that was categorically and beyond anything that was available in our day, something good. Categorically, beyond anything in our day, something beautiful. There was only one problem with it, which is that it wasn't true. So Adams is an interesting figure because, like Dickinson, we see Catholicism is kind of strange and exotic and attractive, but he's willing to sort of give us an articulation of why it's attractive. Because the Christianity, the Christendom of the medieval era provided a vision of what human life and social life and political life could be like if it were well-ordered both intellectually, spiritually, and aesthetically. And it had such appeal to him. He uses my uncle worked for Kodak for 50 years. Kodak was founded fairly early. So Adam's image is of taking his niece on a tour of medieval Europe with a Kodak camera. And what would you take pictures of? And that's how it unfolds. But everything is a picture, but it's a picture that we can only look at and admire, but we can't possess it. So just to sum up, these two figures, Dickinson and Adams, I think really nicely sum up where we find Catholicism in American letters and in American culture in the late 19th century. It's an exotic and foreign presence that's strangely attractive. And to whom is it strangely attractive? Just to reclusive women in Amherst, Massachusetts? Just to expatriate descendants of the Adams family? No, to a lot of people. And I learned this at firsthand, actually, my years at Notre Dame, not by walking on campus, but by walking in downtown South Bend. Because what do you find in downtown South Bend, or in the downtown of practically any town from New England to the west coast of the United States? What you will find is Protestant churches, including low church Protestant churches, Methodists, etc., that have built their churches in the neo-Gothic style. Something that would have been inconceivable before the 19th century. But in the 19th century, there was a sense that the recovery of the aesthetic forms of Catholicism would be essential to the flourishing of Protestant faith in the 19th century. And so, maybe these are not the great monumental architectural monuments, of Chartres and Notre Dame, but they tell us something quite beautiful and even touching about Protestant culture in America in the 19th century, which is just this yearning for a fullness that the Gothic Catholic architectural style represented and that they wanted to recover for themselves. It's only, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what is it that we might say to define this Catholic vision of the world that's symbolized, whether in Aquinas, in Dante, or in 19th century architecture, that had some sort of appeal for these people in the late 19th century and after? And I think, there we go. I want to propose just three things. No. Catholicism is universal vision. One of the first sources of attraction, and we get this especially in Henry Adams, is Catholicism as universal vision, as Catholic. That is to say, providing an integrated vision of the whole of reality that joins together both the discoveries of reason as well as the revelations of faith, and that can see everything, to use Dante as the great example, everything all the way down to hell and all the way up to heaven. So that the horizon of vision, the horizon of the imagination, the horizon of the mind is such that it comprehends everything. And this clearly had a great appeal to people in the 19th century, where there was an increasing sense, drawing out the logic of earlier Reformation Protestantism, an increasing sense of a tension between faith and reason, a tension between this world and anything beyond it. And what Catholicism proposed was that all these things are united under a single order, the order of God's providence. And so to know the whole of reality, to see things whole, as the liberal Protestant English critic Matthew Arnold once put it, is something that you can only do if you have the kind of vision of things that the Catholic Church proposed. Second one is the incarnational character of things. One of the ways in which you unite things into a capacious and universal order is to see no absolute categorical dualistic contradictions between, say, spirit and body, mind and heart, earth and heaven. Rather, to recognize that those distinctions are real, but that they subsist and they even compenetrate one another. And so another characteristic of the Catholic imagination that would find appeal in the 19th century and that we'll see exhibiting itself in the writers I want to share with you tonight is a firm conception of the sacramental or the incarnational character of reality. That everything in the world signifies both itself, so it's a real thing, but that in its incarnate particular reality, it's also itself like a world that can be opened up and explored. That is to say, everything is always more than itself. You know, there's that old joke about Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but the sacramental imagination in the Catholic faith says nothing is ever just anything. Everything is always more than itself. Everything is intrinsically self-transcending, which means, therefore, that as we look at the particularities of the world, even in their basest and most material aspects, those things always bear within them a kind of signification, a kind of sacramental significance that puts us in touch with what is transcendent. Obviously, the Eucharist does this in a distinct and singular way by allowing us to actually commune with God himself. But everything is in some sense sacramental. We have this is a little bit of medieval arcana, and I'm no master of it, but we have the 7 sacraments, and Thomas Aquinas tells us that Christ ordained 7 sacraments. And that's true, but the idea of at one point there were many things that were called sacraments. I think the number maxed out somewhere around 200 is what I've been told. And they said, no, there are 7 sacraments, but then we have this term, the sacramental. A rosary is a sacramental. Prayers, if you have a red mass for lawyers, that's a sacramental. Every moment where the mundane world is transformed by prayer and invocation so as to set it in order with God's providence is a sacramental moment. And so to say that that Catholics had a sacramental imagination isn't to say they think everything is a Eucharist. It's rather that they just think everything always is at once itself, but also stands in some deeper spiritual relation to the order of things that God has created. So that's a second characteristic of the Catholic imagination. A third one is what we might call the, what do I call it here? Yeah. Confession and pilgrimage. I'm just trying trying to avoid reading to you, so I don't want to read this type script. And here I think you'll know what we're saying. I mean, we live in a day where so many people think that everything they do is incredibly important, that it needs to be broadcast on social media. So maybe this is a little hard to envision, but with that kind of self-importance being or narcissism being so rife in our age, but there's a Catholic vision of each person's life is the great drama of fall, of sin, of redemption, and then also a great pilgrimage towards sanctification, towards holiness. And what this entails is that not only is the world sacramental, but each and every human life takes on a sacramental significance. That is to say, my life is in some sense exemplary of human lives in general, and therefore the dramatic details that as I pass from birth to death and beyond, are of great significance, such that we can say his life was a story. It was a story, as Augustine would tell us, of pilgrimage through this world, of pilgrimage from the kingdom of man to the kingdom of God. And so there's this third element to the Catholic imagination that says that the individual not only counts for something, but rather that every individual life has a significance that is exemplary for every other human life about both the folly of sin and the joy of conversion and of being saved. We have, of course, two classic examples of that, which the first one is Augustine's great prayer, the Confessions, which for the first 9 books anyhow, is telling the story of his passage from birth to his conversion. And then we have Dante's Divine Comedy, which of course takes place over the course of a very few days, but given that he, during the course of those few days, passes through hell, purgatory, and heaven, we can say it was a pretty good long journey. Right? So these are the 3 sort of classic ways of describing the features of the Catholic imagination. Capacious or universal, sacramental and incarnational, and then confessional and one of pilgrimage. Can't quite get my parallel structure there. What we see in this fellow, George Santayana, is a very curious moment in American history. So Henry Adams is descended from Boston Brahmins, is Harvard educated, descended from presidents no less, and Harvard educated, and comes to admire Catholicism as a strange, foreign vision of the world that he would love to believe is true, even though he can only accept it as beautiful. George Santayana is who was a professor at Harvard, and in fact was almost exact contemporaries with Henry Adams. He was a little bit younger. In fact, Santayana lived from 1863 until 1952. He lived to a very old age, and in fact, he lived so long that he's going to come back in my story in a little while. At which point he's so old he's reading everything with a magnifying glass. But Santayana has this particular characteristic. He was born in Spain. His father died when he was very young, and his mother remarried, and she married an American, and so they moved to Boston, where he was educated at the famous Boston Latin High School, and then went on to study at Harvard, and then was subsequently appointed a professor of philosophy at Harvard. So we have this mustached Spaniard living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he brings along with himself his Spanish culture, which of course includes his Catholicism. But he was mostly educated in the sort of that same declining Protestant culture that Henry Adams decried and sought to escape. And the consequence was this. Santayana came to believe that everything he had learned from his Catholicism was good and beautiful, just as Henry Adams would say. It just simply wasn't true. But since he was born into what was good and beautiful, even though he was forced to live among what was true, the sort of disillusioned and declining world of turn-of-the-century Cambridge, Massachusetts, he simply made what you might call a deal with himself, which is the deal, and it's a deal that he spent much of his career trying to propagate among other people, was that you have to, as he puts it in the last lecture he gave before he left the United States forever, you must live in the mind. Yes, the world, as Henry Adams would have said, is just a sprawling material abyss following the second law of thermodynamics, second law. But in the mind, there we have a cosmos that has shape. There we have a cosmos that has form. And the form is the form that the church gives to us. So what he denies as literally true, he accepts, you might say, as morally true. And his words to this effect are so wonderful that I've got to read them for you. Although I learned my prayers and catechism by rote, as was then inevitable in Spain, I knew that my parents regarded all religion as a work of human imagination. And I agreed, and still agree, with them there. But this carried an implication in their minds against which every instinct in me rebelled. Namely, that the works of human imagination are bad. No, said I to myself, even as a boy. No, they are good. They alone are good. And the rest, the whole real world, is ashes in the mouth. What was this world of the imagination? It was a world that he discovered in reading the great philosophers of antiquity, Plato and Aristotle, but also that he discovered in reading Dante, whom he was a very controversial professor in his day, but not for reasons that would have been obvious, to at least not seem obvious to us. For instance, his most controversial position in late 19th century America was that he showed that Shakespeare was nothing compared with Dante. In fact, he has published an essay in his second book called The Absence of Religion in Shakespeare, which shows Shakespeare to just be this kind of a brute, you might say, who just can't put anything together and just can't figure out how the world works. He just sees evil everywhere and cries out in agony, which Santayana immediately contrasts with Dante, who really saw evil but saw it as part of an ordered whole. For those of you who like your T.S. Eliot, this is where T.S. Eliot got that idea. T.S. Eliot's most famous for saying it, but he borrowed it from his former professor, George Santayana. So Santayana's poems, because they're about imagination, are poems that encourage us to think of our lives as a sacramental spiritual pilgrimage or ascent towards a vision of the whole. And here's a sonnet of his that expresses that probably more crisply than any of his other poems. "'Tis love that moveth the celestial spheres in endless yearning for the changeless one, and the stars sing together as they run to number the innumerable years. 'Tis love that lifteth through their dewy tears the rose's beauty to the heedless sun, and with no hope nor any guerdon won, love leads me on, nor end of love appears. For the same breath that did awake the flowers, making them happy with a joy unknown, kindled my light and fixed my spirit's goal. And the same hand that ruined the flying hours and chained the whirling earth to Phoebus' throne, in love's eternal orbit keeps the soul." So the most conspicuous features of this is Michelangelo, of course, is better known as a sculptor than as a poet to us, but in Italy, of course, he's second or third only to Dante and Petrarch. And in Michelangelo's sonnets are almost all devotional sonnets that are in what I would call the Christian Platonist tradition. They think of the Christian life in terms of this ascent to the one, to God as the one. And what Santayana has done here is, writing in the 1890s, has taken the conventions and the images of Michelangelo and made his own original poem. And this is what he did. His collected poems are about 800 pages, even though, and I told you how long he lived into the 1950s. He actually quit writing poetry at the turn of the 20th century. So those 800 pages of poems come from a young man's hand. It's quite impressive. You get just a hint of his unbelief here. Love leads me on. The love of the imagination leads up towards ascent, towards unity with the changeless one God. But nor end of love appears. Well, nor end of love appears, that can be read two ways. On the one sense, the contemplation of the changeless one is, as the medieval mystics would put it, is a sort of infinite abyss, an endless delectation of the presence of the light of God. But you can kind of hear Santayana suggesting nor end of love appears, as in we're to live for the life of the mind. And so in that sense, God is a creature of our imagination. So we're to try to ascend to this creature of our imagination, even though we'll never actually arrive at him. Right? So there's a little bit of a painful recognition of his basic materialism. The reason I all but begin with Santayana is because of how important this relatively minor poem is. In Adams and in Dickinson, Catholicism is a foreign property present in the body of the American Republic. Santayana also feels very foreign. He never felt quite Spanish nor quite American. He sometimes spoke of himself as trying to say as many un-English things in English as he possibly could. But on the other hand, he's a professor of philosophy at Harvard who educated 2 generations of America's elite in philosophy and literature. And so, in a sense, he's proposing to these young men the beautiful image that Adams could write a book about but couldn't believe. And Santayana's saying, well, I don't believe it either, but you still ought to follow it. You still ought to live your life this way. It's only a matter of time before somebody says, wait, so you're telling me this is beautiful, it is good, but it's not true. What if it's true? And that's what happened. America was a smaller place, and so you can kind of tell the story of our country in fewer chapters and with fewer representative figures at one point than you can now. So Alan Tate is all but a representative figure for the early 20th century, the kind of young man who, in the wake of the First World War, would have been educated by somebody like George Santayana. And here's what I mean by that. Tate was actually educated at Georgetown, though he was not born to as a school when it was a school for boys. But he was certainly not from a Catholic family. He was from a completely dysfunctional family, and his father Orley disappeared early in his life, and he would travel around from hotel room to hotel room with his mother. I think it was, a little familiar. Anyhow. And in his years at Vanderbilt, he fell in love with the Old South that he really hardly knew. His people were Southern, but he spent much of his childhood outside of the South. And the fellows that he began to share poetry with, write criticism with, first called themselves the Fugitives and then called themselves the Southern Agrarians. And in 1930, just at the start of the Great Depression, they published a brilliant book called I'll Take My Stand. And it was a defense of what they called the agrarian way of life against the Northern tyrannical industrialism. So a little bit of naivete there, but nonetheless, the book as a whole is quite brilliant and fascinating to read. But what's really peculiar is Tate's contribution to it. The religion of the Old South. He compares it, you might say, to a horse with 2 parts, and the Old South had one part of the horse, but it missed the other. I don't remember which part was missing. I presume the head. What he meant by that was this. He was a great defender of the Old South for its sense of manners and gentility and culture, what you might sum up as its Roman, as in Rome of the Roman Empire, its Roman stoic ethic. And those of you who maybe know the novels of Walker Percy, somebody mentioned earlier tonight, if you know Walker Percy, his novels, all of his Southern characters, they have lots of things in which they could possibly believe. And one of them is believing in the Southern ethic, which is not Christian, it's not American, it's something it's distinctive. And that's what Tate saw in the Old South. He saw this great Roman stoic ethic symbolized. He wrote several biographies of Confederate soldiers. He never finished the one on Robert E. Lee because Lee resembled his father too much, and so he could never get it done. But anyhow, what he saw in them was this heroic civic virtue. a sense of being willing to suffer for a cause, to suffer for the fate of the city, just as Aeneas in Virgil's great Roman poem about the founding of the Roman Empire, the Aeneid, the way Aeneas suffers out of piety both to the gods of Rome, his father, the country itself as a patria, as a fatherland, and then for his own actual family, his son Ascanius and their generations after. So what Tate argues in this essay in 1930 is that the South had so many good Roman qualities. It had, the Roman virtues, the Roman sense of civil duty, and so on and so forth. What it didn't have was a Roman religion. It had, as he put it, a poor horse trader's religion, by which he meant sort of Southern evangelical Protestantism. So that's not my prejudice, that's Tate's, and he grew up there. So I'll leave it to him. And so this is something he writes in 1930. Over the next 20 years, he writes countless essays defending the necessity of Catholic faith, even while he does not have it. Only in the early 1950s, I think it might have been 1950 actually, is he converted to the church with the great French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain as his godfather, excuse me. So I want to share this poem with you. This is a relatively early poem, Aeneas at Washington, where Aeneas, the grandfather, to speak loosely, the founder of Rome and the Roman Empire and all the grandeur that unfolded from the eternal city, is standing on the Potomac looking at the domes of Washington, D.C. And here's what he says. I myself saw furious with blood Neoptolemus, at his side the black Atridae, Hecuba, and the 100 daughters. Priam cut down his filth, drenching the holy fires. In that extremity I bore me well, a true gentleman, valorous in arms, disinterested and honorable. Then fled, that was a time when civilization, run by the few, fell to the many, and crashed to the shout of men, the clang of arms. Cold victualling I seized. I hoisted up the old man, my father, upon my back, in the smoke made by sea for a new world, saving little, a mind imperishable. If time is a love of past things, tenuous as the hesitation of receding love, to the reduction of uncitied literals, we brought chiefly the vigor of prophecy, our hunger breeding calculation and fixed triumphs. I saw the thirsty dove in the glowing fields of Troy, hemp ripening in tawny corn, the thickening bluegrass, all lying rich forever in the green sun. I see all things apart, the towers that men contrive, I too contrived long, long ago. Now I demand little. The singular passion abides its object and consumes desire in the circling shadow of its appetite. There was a time when the young eyes were slow, their flames steady beyond the firstling fire. I stood in the rain, far from home at nightfall, by the Potomac. The great dome lit the water. The city my blood had built I knew no more, while the screech owl whistled his new delight, consecutively dark. Stuck in the wet mire, 4,000 leagues from the 9th buried city, I thought of Troy, what we'd built her for. So, this is not the most difficult of poems, though it certainly takes some working into. It's really merely Aeneas looking on the modern democratic order that Henry Adams had decried, but looking on it as a representative of an ancient civilization and comparing the two and thinking of his own piety, his own bravery. And those of you who know Virgil's Aeneid know that one of the greatest scenes in all of our literature is as Troy is burning and is being reduced to smoldering rocks. Aeneas, at the prompting of the gods, picks up his father on his back. His father holds the hearth gods, so the representatives of divinities, on his back, because Aeneas can't hold them because his hands are covered in blood from fighting Greeks. And then he grabs Ascanius, his son, by the hand, and he leads them out of the city into the mountains. This is just the greatest image of pietas, of piety, that the Roman imagination can envision. And in fact, it has a pretty good run at being the best image that any of us can imagine. It's just such a wonderful image of faithfulness to the gods, to country, to family, and to the future. And from that sort of heroic pietas, Aeneas wonders what's become of the modern age. It's a poem of critique, of course, because this is written, as I said, early in Tate's life, when he's still trying to envision what would make it possible, as it were, for America to be a new Rome. And the challenge he faced is that he's, like so many of us, he was a great believer in history and the power of history. You get that little screech owl. It's kind of like the owl of Athena flying at night from Hegel's philosophy. The idea of history has its inevitable course, and there's no reversing it. And so therefore, some things that were once possible will no longer be possible to us today. Tate, when he did finally convert to the Catholic Church, realized something that was deeply profound about the human person. And that is, history can't tell you what's true. 2 + 2 = 4 is true always. And in order to enter into the eternity of thought, the eternity of truth, all you have to do is say silently to yourself, 2 + 2 = 4. And the moment you do that, you've transcended all of history. Because if the world had never existed, that fact would still be true. And so it took him a long time to realize that we're not historically determined beings, we're historically, culturally transcendent beings. And we transcend it by way of our soul and our mind. It took him a long time to discover that. So, Austin, I want to make sure I stay within time. Where do we want to stop tonight?
We have about, we can do 15 minutes more.
That would be great. Okay. So Tate's most famous student was another figure who bears an uncanny resemblance to Henry Adams, and that is Robert Lowell. Robert Lowell came from the same sort of stock of distinguished Boston Brahmins that the Adams clan represented. But early in his youth, first he fell under the spell of Tate and Tate's fellow poet and critic, John Crowe Ransom, and the vision of poetry as a serious kind of work at discovering the truth that they proposed to him. And then he realized that if poetry is a way of discovering the truth, then all that beauty that Santayana and everybody was talking about must also be true. And so he converted to Catholicism, and Lowell did nothing haphazardly or casually, or to put it more bluntly, without a sense of great self-importance. And so this descendant of the blue-blooded Boston Brahmins, when he converted to Catholicism, it was in nearly all of his poems over the course of his first 2 published books. He's telling us again and again, I have this natural genealogy. In fact, I've got a better genealogy or a better pedigree than you have, my friends. But that's not my true pedigree. My true genealogy, my true birth is the new creation that occurs in baptism. And so during the Second World War, he was a conscientious objector. He refused to fight in the war on Catholic religious principles. He was not alone in this, as you probably know, even among writers, I mean. J.F. Powers, the Chicago, Minneapolis fiction writer, also was a conscientious objector. In fact, he and Lowell were good friends, in part because they had that shared experience of having been not imprisoned, but assigned, both of them, to work as hospital orderlies for the duration of the war as punishment for their objection. Writing in 1945 at the end of the war, still, I believe, working as a hospital orderly on Long Island, Lowell writes this poem where he contrasts, you might say, the natural history that his blood kin have begotten with the spiritual rebirth, and the contradiction that represents the birth of Christ. The Holy Innocents is the title of the poem. Listen, the hay bells tinkle as the cart wavers on rubber tires along the tar and cindered ice below the burlap mill and alewife run. The oxen drool and start in wonder at the fenders of a cat, and blunder hugely up St. Peter's Hill. These are the undefiled by woman. Their sorrow is not the sorrow of the world. King Herod shrieking vengeance at the curled up knees of Jesus choking in the air. A king of speechless clods and infants. Still, the world out Herods Herod, and the year, the 1945th of grace, lumbers with losses up the clinkered hill of our purgation. And the oxen, near the worn foundations of their resting place, the holy manger where their bed is corn and holly torn for Christmas. If they die as Jesus in the harness, who will mourn? Lamb of the shepherds, child, how still you lie. So we have this image of an ox cart clambering up a hill, an image of a screaming king of this world, Herod, out Heroding himself. I love that phrase. It comes to us from Shakespeare. And this is the loud voice, you might say, of the secularized culture of the modern age. And Lowell, and I don't want to overstate his sense of self-importance, but I think it's fair to say this about the poem. And Lowell places the entirety of the Catholic faith, the entirety of Christian revelation, as an innocent, helpless, speechless babe in the manger, which of course is true. But the power of this vision for him is precisely that the world out Herod's Herod, the world believes in force and conquest, and here we are fighting the Second World War, or rather bringing it to its close, the clash of arms, finally falling silent. And the only witness the Christian can bear, as he tried to do as a conscientious objector, is the equivalent of the silent witness of a babe in the manger, helpless, incapable of exercising force, but nonetheless speaking of another order that transcends the world. When George Santayana, now living amongst nuns in a convent, which had a retirement home in Rome, read Lowell's book, he was convinced, somebody mentioned to me tonight, Father Richard John Newhouse, he was convinced of something that Father Richard Newhouse was always convinced of, that the future of America was Catholic, that Lowell represented the best of American literature, and that Lowell would transform American culture through his Catholic sacramental vision, where the ox and the cart take on this great cosmic significance. I think Lowell was not a terribly healthy person, and really apostatized from the church only a few years later, though he always remained a Christian, but he left the faith. And I think that signals, you might say, a moment of both hope, but also unrealized or frustrated hope in American letters. Because there were so many people before him, Alan Tate, Santayana, others, of whom Lowell seemed almost like the cumulative moment of what they had fostered intellectually and spiritually in American culture, where the Boston Brahmin finally really would be Catholic. And he was. And then it was gone. Lowell's great poem of apostasy comes, I forget which book it is, but it's, he was in Rome, traveling to Rome, when Pius XII proclaimed the doctrine of the Assumption in 1952. And the poem, which is quite a brilliant poem, it's about crossing the Alps, which of course crossing the Alps is an old expression for conversion to Catholicism. But he's literally crossed the Alps on a train, and he arrives at Rome, and he hears the roar of the crowd crying out in joy as the Pope announces this doctrine, and Lowell's response in the poem is, "Who can believe this? Who can understand it?" And it's just so you feel this great tide of faith suddenly ebbing back. Well, I don't want to leave you on that down note, because I think, in fact, the example of Lowell is not of a possible moment of Catholicism entering into the center of American letters and then fading back to the margins just when it seemed like it stood a chance. To the contrary, I think Lowell represents a genuine entering into of American culture that is sustained. And just for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to mention a few things. So I mentioned earlier the poet critic Ivor Winters, who loved Thomas Aquinas. Ivor Winters, along with Alan Tate, was one of the great American poets of the first half of the 20th century. And just as Tate influenced Lowell and others, Ivor Winters influenced a whole generation of poets from his small office on the campus of Stanford University. There's a whole generation of poets, including 4 previous poet laureates of the United States, all of whom studied with Ivor Winters. There are many, many great poets among them, sort of a Venn diagram. Some of them were poet laureates, some of them were good poets, and some of them were both. But Helen Pinkerton is a particularly precious example. She, more than any of Winters' students, saw that he loved Thomas Aquinas. And so she began reading Thomas Aquinas, and she read Thomas Aquinas better and more carefully than Winters did. Winters was kind of superficial in comparison. Pinkerton dove deeply into the metaphysics of Aquinas. And so you've probably heard of the great metaphysical poets of the 17th century, John Donne, George Herbert, Thomas Crashaw, etc. But when that term was applied to them, it was meant as an insult, as in their poetry was too complicated, it was too metaphysical. It's the same use of the word that when Edmund Burke denounced the orchestrators of the French Revolution, he called them mere metaphysicians, as in abstract thinkers who were going to ruin the world. Pinkerton wrote genuinely metaphysical poetry, as in most of her lyric poems are these brilliant meditations on the fact that things exist. So I'll just read you this one poem. You find it here. So it's about seeing a red-tailed hawk in California, and pay attention as she speaks of the loft of air, because what is that loft of air? It's what makes possible its flight. It's written to another one of Winters' students, one who's still alive today, actually. Your hawk today floated the loft of air that lifts each morning from the valley floor, dark idler, predator of mice and hare and greater vermin, as I watched him soar. Out of my sight, taking a certain path, knowing from ancient blood, instinctive might, how to survive beyond the present drift. He seemed to shift from nothingness toward flight. Yet it was real, the warm column of air, like being unrecorded, always there. Just mention 2 moments here. The hawk is instinctive. It's blood. If you know this line from Tennyson in the post-Darwinian age, thinking of nature as red in tooth and claws, just a mechanical violence of the survival of the fittest. That's what the hawk could represent, and often does represent in people's imaginations and in our literature. But she looks through the hawk's bloody instinct and sees a greater miracle, and that is the hawk's flight is made possible only by air. So, my life is made possible only by the fact that I first received my being from another. Being, the gift of existence, stands below and sustains as real everything else that I take to be reality. It's possible to only think about those things. But if you do, you're being literally superficial. You're only thinking about the surface of things. It's actually the invisible loft of air where the real mystery is, that things exist. So we have a great example of a distinguished American poet who had a career over 70 years. I'm proud to say that for the last 10 years of her life, she and I exchanged letters almost every week, just giving us a beautiful vision of the American West, but from the perspective of Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics. And she's not just saying Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics is beautiful. She's saying it's the truth that explains things to us. I want to end with one final poet, and I'm going to skip a few slides here. I'd love to talk with you about Paul Mariani, if we had world enough in time, and to Catherine Chandler, who's an American-born Canadian poet. But I want to end with this Ryan Wilson, born 1982. In my book, that's young. What I want to share with you is twofold. First of all, it's one of those nice bits of fortuity that the way I discovered this fellow's poetry was that when I was first publishing my poems in magazines, I would sometimes turn the page, and on the next page to a James Matthew Wilson poem would be a Ryan Wilson poem, and I'd think, who's this guy, and why is he following me? I went to give a poetry reading at the Catholic University of America. This was back in 2015 or 16, and I had a wonderful time, and I went out to dinner afterwards, and I sat down with my host at the table, and I said, oh, shoot, I forgot. There's this young poet whose work I've been reading, and he has my same name. His name's Ryan James Wilson. And I had meant to meet him if he was in town, and as I figured he would be, because he was a student at the university. And at that moment, the stool, it was a bar stool, literally turns around, and that was Ryan Wilson. And so we spent the rest of the night talking about Robert Lowell and other things. But I want to end with just this poem of his, which is called Xenia, which is the Greek word for hospitality to the foreign. So here, a young Catholic poet writing not about Catholicism as a foreign object, in a strange foreign object in the American land, but rather speaking of Xenia, of hospitality, not of being a guest, but rather of being a host. One day, a silent man arrives at your door in an outdated suit, threadbare and black, like a lost mourner or a Bible salesman who's been robbed. Penniless, he needs a place to stay. And you, magnanimous you, soon find this stranger reading in your chair, eating your cereal, drinking your tea, or standing in your clothes at the window, awash in afternoon's alien light. You tire of his constant company. Your floorboards creak with his shuffling footfalls, haunting dark rooms deep in the night. You lie awake in blackness, listening, cursing the charity or pride that opened up the door for him, and wonder how to explain yourself. He smells like durian and smoke, but it's mostly his presence, irksome, fogging the mind up like breath on a mirror. You practice cruelty in a mirror, then practice sympathetic faces, you ghoul. Your cunning can't deceive you. You are afraid to call your friends for help, knowing that what they would say. It's just you two. You throw a fit when he sneaks water into the whiskey bottle, then makes amends. You have no choice except to learn humility, to love this stranger as yourself, who won't love you or ever leave. So I think when the Catholic poet has become the host, we have reached the completion of our story. So thank you. Yes?
Which one is your favorite and why?
Oh, the poems here? Gosh, that's tough. I like all these poems a lot, actually. They each have a power for me. I think you have in the handout a poem I didn't read, which is by Paul Mariani, Quid Pro Quo. And that one, it can't be my favorite, because when I first read it, I didn't even like it. But I came to really appreciate it. One of the things I like about it is it's about his grief and his anger at God for the repeated miscarriages of his wife. one of many reasons I like that poem is for a very personal reason. It ends with him describing his wife finally conceiving and carrying to term to a young baby who gets called Paul Mariani Jr. And then the same God that Paul Mariani Sr. is angry at, he then watches his son take his vows as he enters the Jesuit order here in Chicago. And as it happens, just days before that taking of final vows, I got to spend with the Mariani family. And so it's always been a very personal poem to me because I got to see Paul. In fact, last time I was here in Chicago, I was walking down the street and there was Paul Mariani Jr. I walked right by Loyola's campus. So that was neat. I think the poem that probably is my favorite of all of these is that, as modest as it is that poem by Helen Pinkerton's, because I think she does something that so few poets in our age have done, which is to do what Dante did, and to raise to unite poetry and philosophy in a profound and beautiful way, which I think is very important because historically, the reason that poetry has been the paradigmatic art form in human civilization is because it's the place where all the aspects of human inquiry, from theology and philosophy down to meteorology and farming techniques, find their home, find a repose. And so she's restored to poetry some of the great qualities or substance that it once had and should have again, I hope. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Catholicism and American poetry and kind of the ebbs and flows of formalism in the last 100, 150 years? And where do you see those two connecting or not interconnecting?
Yes.
Relating?
Yeah. If you were a plant in this audience, I would have had you ask that question. I came to poetry out of interest in meter and rhyme. As it happens, in the same few months span, I learned how to write a line of iambic pentameter, and I also, as far as I knew, for totally unrelated reasons, read the Divine Comedy. And those were the two great moments of my education. But they had no intrinsic connection, as far as I knew. I was an aspiring fiction writer and novelist, and was writing very. What's the word? I was nothing if not what's that word? Huh? Yeah, I was nothing if not fecund. Yes, it was like rabbits. Yeah, so low quality rabbits. But anyhow, but I wrote a lot of fiction, and in fact, when I quit writing fiction, I had an agent. Like, I thought I was had reason to believe I was on the cusp of a career as a novelist, and then one day I just stopped. And the reason I stopped is because I realized what I had figured out years earlier but had not dared to admit to myself, was that all I really cared about was ordering syllables so that they formed iambic pentameter. That's all I wanted to do. And it didn't occur to me that this putting of syllables into numerical order might have anything to do with what Dante was doing, putting syllables into order in the Terza Rima. It was only years later I read the Book of Wisdom, and in chapter 11, he orders all things in number, measure, and weight, and realized that for 2 millennia, Christians had been looking at that passage and saying, this is the explanation of the world, that God orders the world according to order, number, and weight. And I've spent the last 15 or so years reading as much St. Augustine as I could, including the not incredibly provocative treatise on De Musica, where he just takes you through various Roman metrical feet for 200 pages before suddenly at the end, and he says, and that's how we come to a knowledge of God. And but it's a little longer than that. But when I looked in retrospect, I realized that whenever Augustine tries to comprehend eternity in itself, and specifically how God could be the everlasting, eternal cause of all things, and yet history and time still take place, whenever he tries to ponder that mystery, he always returns to the line of verse. The art of poetry is one and eternal. It doesn't change, but yet it's changing every minute in its actual practice. And so it's through thinking about the Roman quantitative verse line that he came to understand the relationship of the particular, the one and the many, the passing and the eternal, the contingent and the absolute. And so I think what I was finding in putting syllables in order to create iambs was the same thing, something akin, but without the hubris, that Galileo felt when he said, God speaks mathematics. It was that I was entering into the mystery of God's creation, and it was not a creative act, it was an act of discovery, of finding, of sounding things. Which, not to go on too long about this, but this is why Dante and Aquinas are so valuable, and behind Aquinas, Aristotle are so valuable, because of course it's Aristotle in the Metaphysics who says, those Pythagoreans, they think numbers are everything. No. Numbers are just an entree into the realm of being. And so it's, as Shakespeare, as Plato has it in the Republic, mathematics is a liberal art, because it leads you up, your mind up in ascent from appearances to reality. And once I saw that, I realized this is what I was doing. I was trying to get from appearance to reality, to find a mode of exploration. And the practice of meter, the form itself, not anything I wrote about, but the way I wrote, was entering into the mystery of being. So that's how it's always been for me. If you talk to somebody like Dana Gioia, the connections are going to be much more contingent. But that's because he sometimes writes in free verse, and I don't do that unless I'm making fun of somebody. Oh, yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. This is a very, very interesting lecture. I think it may go a little bit above some of our heads. I'm struggling through your fortunes of poetry and the economy and enjoying it.
Oh.
But the question is, you mentioned that the poetry is supposed to please and delight.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it pleases and delights an awful lot of people in 21st century America. And I guess it makes sense. You said you really like that Helen Pinkerton poem. And what's appealing about that is it's about a thing.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at it, it's on the surface, but we can understand what she's saying. She's talking about the Santayana,
Mm-hmm.
much deeper meaning. We are kind of anti-sacramental society now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's, with the rise of technology and virtual reality and the divorce between even this transgender movement, there seems to be a divorce between
Mm-hmm.
spirit and matter.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry's going to have a tough time
Mm-hmm.
in that kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you can recite for us one of your poems, and Aeneas mentioned the fortunes of formalism, and I think your poems tend to be more formal than some modern poetry.
Mm.
Would you recite for us one of your poems that you think will please and delight us?
Yes. Do I say in Fortunes that they're supposed to please and delight? That sounds like Horace. That's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And the Renaissance.
I think because I go farther than that. Yeah. So, yes. So, as I told you, as a 19-year-old, a professor in a seminar was trying to teach us what iambic pentameter was, and I don't remember what else he said that day, because I spent after he explained what the pentameter was, the verse of Shakespeare, I spent the whole rest of the class period trying to write a single line of it. And it took me the good 50 minutes. A sonnet every day for 5 long years. That's what I wrote. And I can't believe how hard that was. I went home that night, and I wrote 13 more lines, and I had a sonnet. It took me 5 hours to write the other 13 lines. I came home the next night, and I did another one. Next night after that, did another one. At the end of the week, I had 5 sonnets about a fellow who was upset that Ronald Reagan had been elected president, and so he moved to the Jersey Shore and was drinking himself to death. I don't know where that came from, but that was my fiction writer's mind, I guess, there. And it was so hard to do that. And and they still weren't any good, but they were, sort of roughly iambic and roughly rhymed. I would contrast that with a moment many years later. It's the morning 2 days before my wedding, when I had promised my fiancée that I would compose a poem that would be put on a little scroll with just, a little chocolate on the tables of all, for all the guests at the reception. But I had come up with nothing. That night, 2 nights before the wedding, I was sleeping for the first time in the apartment that was going to become our apartment very soon thereafter. And I woke up, and I had 4 lines in my head. Though neither young nor old, nor full of wine, not blind exactly, though my sight was poor, I crouched, a beggar, waiting for a sign so obvious the dead could not ignore. And I just got up and I wrote that down, and it was there. And then, not 5 hours later, but 5 minutes later, I had the rest of the sonnet, and I was done. A flaneur, so much as is possible in a despoiled city such as this. Amid the listless crowd, I casually stroll, searching for a stare not quite purposeless. A bibliographic recluse with, a bibliographic recluse in his room. No, how can I lose this after all these years? Let me see if I can do it from the beginning. I don't think I'll be able to. I can feel it. I'm feeling a little blocked there. Though neither young nor old nor full of wine, not blind exactly though my sight was poor, I crouched a beggar waiting for a sign so obvious the dead could not ignore. A flaneur so much as is possible in a despoiled city such as this. Amid the listless crowd I casually stroll, searching for a stare not quite purposeless. A bibliographic recluse in his room. What muse could make me close my book? Some Old West drunk passed out by the spittoon. What face could cure me with a look? Then you came, sign, stare, word, and look, and brought a new life where none was, but one was sought. Thank you. Didn't think I was going to get to the spittoon.
Did you like it?
It had a critical reception that is unlike anything that anything else. Yes. So, my Aunt Joanne was very proud that she could interpret the poem for her less gifted younger siblings. So as you said, it doesn't always please and delight. Oh, yes.
This is a much less exalted question.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, Poetry Magazine and the Poetry Foundation are still based in Chicago.
Yes.
They built a big building downtown.
Yes.
I'm curious to know if you have ever submitted to them, and would they be caught dead publishing poetry of a Catholic sensibility?
It wasn't that long ago that poetry was pretty close to being not only the oldest and richest, but actually one of the best magazines in the country. One of the best poetry. When Christian Wyman was editing it, he was a very good poet. He's not an unfailing poet or an unfailing critic, but certainly a gifted one and worthy of editing the magazine. In the years he edited it, which were quite a few, it was really great. It was terrific. He left, actually, poetry to go to Yale Poetry Magazine, to go to Yale right around the time I started publishing poems. So though I've gotten to know him over the years, his stint as editor did not overlap in a time when I could have taken advantage of our friendship to try to squeeze a poem into the pages. It's very unfortunate. After he left, the insanity didn't begin 2 years ago in the much publicized things. The insanity began much sooner. So I did annually submit 3 or 4 poems on the principle that if they were accepted, I would get a lot of money for them. But I actually, sometimes the poems would actually get rejected, but most of the time they wouldn't get rejected, and not because they were thinking of being caught dead with me in their pages, but because I would send the poems to poetry, but that was sort of just a gauntlet being thrown down, and then I would send the poems to other editors, and they would all be published before poetry had even reviewed the submission. I can't tell you how many number of times that happened, but I stopped doing that 2 years ago when the poetry in that magazine became so bad that I not only would sort of say, well, I slipped one, even though I don't really respect you guys too much. Now I would be embarrassed to be published in the magazine. Yes. Yeah. I don't want to gross you out. I haven't had dinner yet, first of all, so I don't want to gross you out with descriptions of some of the poems in there. But they're actually revolting. They're not just bad. They're actually, and you don't have to be a poetry aficionado to determine they're bad. You can see it pretty. It's pretty on the surface. So yeah, it's really, when they got that great endowment years ago, I think the New Yorker magazine commented it was something like leaving $50 million to your cat. But it was, that wasn't true at the time. It was a magazine that had a really august history. That fellow Ivor Winters, that I mentioned, who was, spent most of his career at Stanford University and spent most of his life out west, but he was actually a Chicago-raised boy who started his education at the University of Chicago. He would have finished it, except that he caught tuberculosis and so had to move to the west for the drier environment. He truly was one of the great American poets of the 20th century, and he published all of his early poems and his early criticism in Poetry magazine under Marion Monroe, who founded that magazine, was sort of a mentor for him. So it had a wonderful lineage, and there have been great poems in its history that have been published there, but now it really is the cat's litter box, so yeah. Not to be too subtle about it. So.
Now, we do have one question from our online audience tonight. So
there's an online audience? Nobody at Poetry Magazine, I hope.
So I'll let you make this question, which will. Is the Catholic imagination in the mind of these poets redemptive of the human person or a culture or a country? Is the Catholic imagination in the mind of these poets redemptive?
Yes, that's a great question. It's not even, sorry, I could make of it several things, but the way in which I think I'm hearing the question, I think the answer is yes, and that is, what I mean by that is this. The language of the church tells us that that salvation is the salvation of baptism is the salvation that is not just from sin to grace and redemption. It's not just from evil and fallenness to born again and good. It rather has something to tell us about whether our life is a waste of time or not, whether we're living in vain, whether all of our actions, which are all directed towards an end, are finally exercises in futility. And I think that third element of the Catholic imagination, that confessional pilgrimage aspect, is saying that when you learn to envision the world as the church teaches us to, you recognize that your life is a story that has to end as a comedy. But it can't end as a comedy until you can begin to see it as possibly being a comedy. Right? So it's the beginning of redemption to begin to think this way. I mentioned Dana Gioia earlier, and in fact I had intended to mention him and Frederick Turner, who are two of the great Catholic poets of our age. in Dana's 2012 book, Pity the Beautiful, the anchor poem in that book is a long narrative poem called Haunted, which is one of the great poems of the 21st century so far. And it's a ghost story. And it's about a man who doesn't believe in ghosts. In fact, he doesn't believe in anything, but he goes with a casual acquaintance, a lover, to a house in western Massachusetts, not near Amherst, I presume, a mansion house, where there are wings and wings of objet d'art. There's a wine cellar of ancient vintages. And they have a fight, and he walks off, stomps off, as it were, leaving the woman in another room. And he goes into a bedroom, and he finds a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets and starts reading it. And as he's reading it in bed, a ghost enters in. And he thinks it's the maid that isn't aware that people are in the house, so he gets up to talk to her, and the ghost turns towards him and says, "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." So he runs out of the house. He runs down the road, leaving behind Shakespeare and his shoes, as a line has it. And then we find that the man telling this story of his life is a monk who is delivering brandy from the monastery to a local bar. And he says, "I still don't believe in ghosts. I still don't believe in an afterlife. This is the life I didn't want to waste." And I think what he's describing there is that the church gives us a vision that orients us towards eternity, but transforms everything down to the most minute aspects of our life, here and now. And so, in that sense, the Catholic imagination is redemptive in that it changes everything. I think I'll stop there.
That's very nice. Egan, one more time.